Have you ever seen a woman who can walk into a room, smile once, and somehow the whole place softens? Carol Burnett was that kind of woman. For decades, America remembered her for a warm grin, a mischievous glint in her eye, and comedy sharp as a blade. Delivered so smoothly, it never looked like anyone was bleeding in public. People called her the gentlest lady in Hollywood because she carried this almost unreal calm, even though everyone in the business knows television is a battlefield, and laughter is often just a glossy coat over wars nobody's allowed to describe out loud. But then something strange happened. At 90 years old, at the exact age most legends choose silence to protect the image, Carol chose to speak. Not loudly, not theatrically. Just in one rare conversation, she dropped a list. The men she said she could never stomach her entire life. And what made people sit up straight wasn't the phrase itself. It was the fact these weren't strangers. These were the men who stood closest to her. On stage, in boardrooms, in marriage, in those glittering parties where one sentence can humiliate you without anyone ever lifting a weapon. That list made PR people straighten their backs because it wasn't just personal. It touched the machinery of Hollywood itself. Kindness is constantly mistaken for weakness, and the system will always test how much you'll tolerate before you finally snap. "Can't stand here" wasn't petty dislike. It read like a trail of very specific cuts. One man was said to have betrayed trust through infidelity. Another turned love into a fight over assets. Another used power in the quietest way possible, by simply never inviting her into certain rooms or onto certain stages. And another was described as mocking her so crudely she felt forced to go to court to protect her dignity. This is a woman who made the country laugh for a living, but there were moments when she had to choose the coldest road. Draw a line and say, "That's it." And if you're wondering why she'd speak now, the answer may be simple. At 90, you don't have to play adorable for anyone anymore. You get to reclaim the story. Who was there, what they did, and who changed you for good. But the question that makes people hold their breath isn't who does she hate? It's this. Out of all those names, which one weighs the most? And to get to that weight, the story has to start with the first explosion. Not in court, not in headlines, but on a soundstage where laughter was literally gold, where every second of silence had a price tag, and where Carol, for the first time, had to say one sentence so cold the entire room locked up. Do you know the cruelest thing that can happen on a comedy show? It's not a joke that bombs. It's the moment the studio goes dead silent. Not because it's scripted, but because someone's ego just detonated in front of everyone. For Carol, that moment has a name: Studio 33. In the 1970s, American television was an arena. Laughter meant money, ad contracts, leverage. The Carol Burnett show wasn't just popular, it dominated. It was the weekly dinner table ritual for millions of families, something the whole country scheduled life around. At the center was a duo audiences believed were born to stand side by side: Carol and Harvey Korman. Carol was the heart, warm, quick, emotionally precise. Harvey was the bridge, so natural in his timing that when they tossed lines back and forth, people laughed on instinct. From the outside, it looked unbreakable. But in Hollywood, the things that look unbreakable are often just the things being covered up most carefully. According to people who were there, after the lights went down, the early signs started to show. Harvey became shorter, sharper, quicker to snap. It wasn't one sudden blow-up. It built slowly, like heat trapped in a sealed room. And the cruel irony is that the higher the peak, the more fragile the ego becomes. That year, the show was flying. A new season, contracts renewed, awards stacked on awards. On the surface, it was victory. Behind the scenes, whispers started spreading that Harvey couldn't stand feeling like he was the guy standing next to Carol. When you live in the shadow of a star that keeps getting brighter, you either light your own fire, or you start resenting the light that exposes every flaw you've been trying to hide. The tension leaked out in tiny ways. Avoided eye contact, clipped answers, walking past each other like strangers. And then one day, a technical mistake, so small it would normally be fixed in seconds, became the trigger. That afternoon, the studio was rehearsing a segment with guest singer Petula Clark, who had just flown in from London. Everything had to hit on time: cues, marks, lights. And right in the middle of Harvey's bit, the lighting shifted. His face fell into shadow, not catching the light the way it was supposed to. For most people, that's just a lighting adjustment. For an ego stretched tight like a wire, it's humiliation. Harvey stopped. Then he threw the script on the floor, hard, and his voice came out loud and sharp. "How many years has it been and nobody can do this right?" The room went silent. The boom mic operator froze. The lighting crew went cold. The director tried to calm it down, but Harvey kept going, blaming, snapping, cutting into people with words. And then he did the dumbest thing a rising star can do in front of a crew. He dragged Carol into it, implying that even Carol doesn't care. In that second, everyone understood. This wasn't about a light anymore. This was an attack on the soul of the show, on the woman who had held the entire machine together with kindness for years. Carol had been sitting below the stage, watching rehearsal like she always did. She didn't stand up because she wanted to win. She stood up because she knew if she stayed quiet, an undisciplined rage would swallow the whole crew. Carol did not allow her set to become a place where people were permitted to step on each other. She walked straight onto the stage. No yelling, no performance. Just a clear voice, cold enough to raise goosebumps. "Harvey, that's enough. If you can't respect the people here, then you don't need to be here." The room locked up. Because that wasn't a line from a funny lady. That was the line of someone enforcing order for an entire room. Harvey stared at Carol for a long beat, then turned and walked out. Nobody chased him. Nobody dared. Because when someone walks out like that, what snaps isn't a scene. It's trust. Afterward, Carol sat back down. And the pain was right there. She didn't sit like a victor. People later described her staring at the empty chair like she was looking at a friendship that had died without a funeral. She whispered, "I didn't want it to go like this." But he went too far. That sentence shows you the price of kindness when it gets cornered. When you finally have to be firm, people label you cruel. Hollywood loves labels. Within hours, there were headlines. The story spread fast. And the real question wasn't just Harvey threw a script. It was this. If Carol had to say enough, how many times had too far already happened before that day? In the days that followed, the industry boiled like a pressure cooker. People called around. People judged like they'd been standing in Studio 33. Harvey stayed quiet. Carol stayed quiet too. The kind of silence that refuses to turn internal damage into public entertainment. She kept showing up, kept filming, kept making America laugh. But the people close to her saw something else. Exhaustion. The exhaustion of being the adult in the room while your own heart is cracking. Then, as the story was later told, Harvey called CBS and asked to speak with Carol. His voice was small, shaky. "I was wrong. I want to come back." The next morning, he showed up at the staff meeting. The crew held its breath. He apologized to people one by one, then turned to Carol and said, I forgot why I started." Carol smiled, stepped forward, and hugged him. The studio applauded like it was a movie, but the people who witnessed it understood. That hug didn't rewind time. It didn't restore the old trust. It just closed the explosion. The crack was still there. You can apologize, you can return. But the moment you reveal your worst self in front of an entire crew, that doesn't get taken back. Harvey stayed until the golden era ended. Then he faded out quietly. Carol remained polite when she spoke about him later. But if you listen closely, you can hear the tiny thorn. The man who made her laugh the most was also the man who gave her the biggest headaches, and Studio 33 became the scar she carried. In creative work, when two egos collide at the wrong moment, laughter can turn into the sound of glass breaking. After that, Carol became stronger, stricter, more careful with her own emotions. But the next blow didn't come from a co-star. It came from the person once seen as her lifelong teammate, at work and at home. That's why it felt more ruthless. This time, nobody threw a script on the floor. This time, a marriage was thrown into paperwork. If Studio 33 was an explosion you could hear, the next story was a kind of break you couldn't hear at all. It was slow. It was quiet. It happened in meetings, in documents, in those gentle-sounding lines like "let me handle it," that land like needles. At the center was her husband, Joe Hamilton, the man long viewed as the other half of the Carol empire, not just in love, but in backstage power. And as the story has been told, this betrayal didn't come from rage. It came from cold, planned control. They met when Carol was young, stepping into the spotlight. Joe was older, experienced, a producer who understood the system and the levers of power. To Carol, he was the person who looked at her like she mattered. They married. Over time, Joe became not just her husband, but her producer, her advisor, her partner. When the show exploded, they looked like the perfect pair. Carol provided the heart and the laughter. Joe provided structure and stability. One stood on stage. One held the strings behind the curtain. But the smoother a machine runs, the harder it is to notice when someone starts tightening the bolts for their own benefit. With Joe, boundaries were harder because he didn't shout. He didn't slam tables. He just tightened, gradually. Suggestions became, "let me review it first." Review became, "it needs my approval." Guest lists, scripts, the rhythm of the show, more and more, it all passed through his hands. The breaking point came in meetings where Joe pushed to cut the emotional moments so the program would be just comedy. It sounded like producer logic, but to Carol, it was an insult to the show's DNA. She understood audiences don't live on jokes alone. People need feeling to breathe. And that's where the relationship turned. They stopped looking at each other as a team and started looking at each other like opposing sides. One side chasing control, the other protecting the soul. The more successful the show became, the more pressure crushed their private life. Joe was home less. His schedule was heavier. The excuses sounded reasonable enough that you couldn't tell if you were being abandoned or just expected to understand. Carol, at first, chose to believe it was work, because kind people often invent reasons to protect the person they love. Then Hollywood did what Hollywood does. It leaked. Whispers spread about Joe being too close with someone in the editing department in Los Angeles. No name needed. No proof laid on a table. Just sightings, dinners, glances, murmurs loud enough to reach you in a hallway. And the pain wasn't only whether it was true. The pain was that Carol was hearing it from other people, feeling like the last person to know what was happening inside her own marriage. And maybe she still could have swallowed it if it stayed rumor. The thing that reportedly made it collapse was paperwork. According to the account, lawyers discovered Joe had formed a separate production company, putting his name on projects developed from the world Carol created. And one particular project turned it into a knife, an idea born from a sketch Carol built. But on paper, Carol didn't have proportional ownership. It wasn't just emotional betrayal anymore. It felt like her fingerprints were being erased from the very thing she created. Carol confronted Joe, calmly, like someone still speaking to family. "Do you really think it's fair to turn what we built together into your personal property?" And Joe answered with the coldest sentence possible. "This is business, Carol, not personal." That line is a period at the end of a marriage, because it reduces a wife into a resource, a person into a brand, a life into content. And once someone sees you as content, they don't feel guilty taking the bigger cut. Carol filed for divorce. Hollywood got a new movie to watch, this time in court. Reporters camped outside. Headlines screamed about asset splits like they were discussing ratings. But for Carol, it wasn't only about money. It was about reclaiming the right to own her own name, her own work, her own legacy. As the story is told, the final outcome landed. Carol kept the rights to the show's name. Joe received a share of the syndication profits. On paper, it was a settlement. In Carol's life, it was a lesson. They were an incredible team, until Joe forgot she wasn't just a colleague. After the divorce, Joe kept working, but the shine never looked the same. He died later, and Carol did not attend the funeral. A choice outsiders called cold, but people who understand boundaries recognize as exactly that. A boundary. Carol didn't destroy anyone with scandal. She withdrew, closed the door, and kept moving. And that's the pattern in her list. She doesn't retaliate with noise. She punishes by removing access, by making sure certain people never cross her line again. But the story didn't stop there. The next shock didn't come from family or a coworker. It came from a violation of privacy, described as a 3 a.m. phone call that sparked a rumor firestorm the next morning. At 3 a.m., the phone only rings for 2 reasons: disaster or someone deciding your boundaries don't matter. Carol was jolted awake, and a deep, famous voice, recognizable the second it hit her ear, poured through the line. The caller introduced himself with a name everyone in America would know. And in that moment, as the story goes, Carol understood something very Hollywood. Another person's fame can get used like a hall pass into your private life. The call reportedly started with compliments and shop talk. Carol stayed polite, trying to steer it back to safe ground. But it slid into territory that felt personal, too close, like being stared at under a spotlight you never asked for. When the boundary tightened, Carol ended it. No debate, no scene. Just a firm, polite shutdown. "It's late, I have work." She hung up, thinking that was the end. But in Hollywood, last night becomes this morning, with a few suggestive lines. The next day, as it's been recounted, the press spun the call into a story. Who called whom, why, how long, what the tone sounded like. People who weren't there spoke as if they'd been sitting by the phone. And the cruel part is this. Carol hadn't done anything wrong, but she was still the one cleaning up the mess. Because in that game, a powerful man can smile and say, "just a conversation," while a woman gets weighed on the public's moral scale. Carol's anger wasn't only about the call. It was about being turned into a spectacle she never consented to. And from that point on, she reportedly tightened her rules. No late-night calls, no after-midnight access. Not because she was afraid, because she understood boundaries in Hollywood don't exist unless you build them yourself. But that wasn't the deepest pain yet. That was boundary. The next hit was dignity, and it happened where Hollywood loves to strike. At a sparkling party, champagne everywhere, fake smiles everywhere, where every compliment can hide a trap. Carol was at the top then. She walked into those rooms like someone who'd turned laughter into an empire. She stepped up to a table to congratulate a male legend, an icon of class, elegance. Someone made a friendly comment. "Have you seen Carol's show? The whole country loves it." The man smiled and then dismissed her work as childish, over-the-top physical comedy. Basically, I don't get why people like it. A few people laughed awkwardly, because in those rooms, laughter is loyalty. The air dropped. All eyes went to Carol. Swallow it or explode and get labeled too sensitive. Carol chose a third option. She kept her smile, changed her eyes, and delivered one clean line. Maybe people prefer laughing with someone real instead of laughing with perfection. The table went silent. The man froze. Carol nodded politely and walked away. The power of that line was that it didn't dirty her hands. It simply forced him to reveal his arrogance. Hollywood repeated that moment the way it repeats anything cinematic. Some defended him. He was just joking. But audiences, especially women who saw themselves in Carol's warmth, sided with her. And Carol did the thing the system hates most. She didn't go on TV to complain. She didn't do a press tour. She worked. And her real reply was the one Hollywood can't control. Success kept climbing. Support kept climbing. From the 3 a.m. call, Carol learned the steel of boundaries. From the party insult, she learned the weapon of dignity. You don't have to scream to win. But the stronger Carol became, the more loved she became, the more certain powerful men became irritated. And on her list, there's a different kind of man. No public insult, no romantic scandal, no dirty trick. He chose something colder. For decades, he just did one thing. He didn't invite her. There's a kind of power that doesn't make noise. It just stays silent. And that silence, when it's attached to gatekeeping, becomes a long sentence. The no-invite move is brutal because it doesn't give you a fight to fight. It just creates absence, long enough to turn into a message. You don't belong here. That's why for nearly half a century, people kept asking the same question. How did a comedy icon like Carol Burnett, one of the best rhythm keepers in television history, never get asked to host one of the biggest live comedy stages in America even once? By stature alone, she had everything. But that door had a guard, a powerful, creative boss who built a brand like a fortress. In his eyes, Carol represented old television, warm, human, character-driven. He was chasing something younger, sharper, edgier. It sounds like artistic taste, but in Hollywood, taste is often a clean outfit for a quiet judgment. You don't belong here. What makes this sting is that Carol didn't beg for an invitation. She didn't play victim. She stayed on her own stage and kept winning. And because she didn't scream, the exclusion could quietly last year after year. No official rejection letter to argue with, no meeting to confront. Just a door that never opened. People say her name was considered and then quietly tossed aside with reasons that sounded procedural. Not the right tone, not the right season, not the right brand. But not the right fit is power. Power to define who gets called modern and who gets stamped outdated. And when a man with gatekeeping authority stamps you as old, it isn't just a style critique. It redraws the map. Who belongs in the center? Who gets pushed to the edge? Public frustration grew. The system responded with a polite, empty sentence. We choose hosts based on each season's tone. Carol didn't pound on the door. She smiled lightly, sometimes even joked, "Maybe I'm not bold enough for them." It sounded self-deprecating, but it was a blade. Bold doesn't mean right, and gentle doesn't mean weak. And when she was finally asked if she regretted never being invited, she delivered a line that stripped power from the gatekeeper's hands. "I guess they didn't need me, but I didn't need them either." In one breath, she turned excluded into free. And that brings us back to the question hanging from the beginning. Out of all those men, who did Carol never forgive? People want you to pick one name, but the real clue is the type of wound. Carol could hug a man back after a sincere apology. She could walk away from a marriage and still keep her dignity. She could set boundaries with someone who invaded her private life. But gatekeeping, quiet exclusion dressed up as brand, is harder to fix because it isn't one person's tantrum, it's a system. And maybe that's why that wound lasts the longest. It doesn't hurt for a moment. It hurts for years, repeating the same message. You don't even need to be here. So if she never forgave someone, it might not be because he made her cry. It might be because he tried to make her disappear. And Carol answered by doing the opposite. She lasted longer, grew bigger, and forced Hollywood to keep hearing her laughter like a reminder. You can close a door, but you can't shut down a legacy.